Before sunrise, the neighborhood still believed in quiet. Streetlights washed the pavement in a pale amber glow. Lawns were trimmed. Porch swings hung motionless in the warm Oklahoma air. It was the kind of place where doors were left unlocked and children rode bikes until the sky turned dark blue. Nothing about the street suggested it would soon become a crime scene known across the country. Inside one home, the night had already fractured. Police would later describe the house as silent when they entered it. No music, no television, only the echo of a phone call that had already ended. A child's voice had reached emergency dispatchers minutes earlier, urgent, confused, and afraid. Then the line went dead. At first, the scene looked like any other family residence. Framed photographs on the walls, shoes by the door, bedrooms filled with toys and school books, a life interrupted mid-routine. But as officers moved deeper into the house, they realized they were standing inside something much darker, a space where trust had collapsed into violence. What makes this case so unsettling is not just what happened, but where it happened. There were no warning sirens beforehand, no history of police visits, no public signs of danger. From the outside, the family appeared insulated from chaos, quiet, religious, and close-knit. Their home had been a refuge from the world, and yet something had been growing inside that refuge. Investigators would later uncover notebooks filled with disturbing ideas, plans, obsessions, fantasies about recognition and destruction, thoughts that never reached teachers, neighbors, or authorities in time. The story that unfolded was not one of strangers breaking in, but of betrayal from within, of violence conceived in silence, of a line crossed that could never be uncrossed. Before the headlines, before the courtroom, before the sentences, there was just a quiet street and a family still alive inside a home that would never be the same. What happened next would force an entire town to confront a question with no easy answer. How does something like this begin when everything looks so ordinary? From the outside, the Bever household looked like a portrait of quiet stability. The family lived in a modest home in Broken Arrow, a growing suburban community known for low crime rates, strong schools, and tight-knit neighborhoods. It was the kind of place built around routine workdays, church services, and children's schedules structured around school and family life. At the center of the home were the parents, David Bever and April Bever. David worked in information technology, a job that provided steady income and predictability. April was a homemaker who devoted herself to raising their 7 children. The family followed a conservative Christian lifestyle, homeschooling some of the children and emphasizing discipline, obedience, and faith. To neighbors and acquaintances, the Bevers appeared private but functional. They were not known for loud arguments or visible conflict. The children were often seen together, moving as a group, walking, riding bikes, or accompanying their parents to church-related activities. Their lives seemed structured and insulated from outside influence. Inside the household were 7 siblings: Robert Bever, the oldest son; Michael Bever, the second oldest, followed by younger brothers and sisters ranging in age from toddlers to preteens. The family dynamic, as later described in court documents, was hierarchical. Authority rested with the parents. Older children were expected to help care for younger ones. Discipline was firm, and the household was socially isolated compared to many families in the area. There was little unsupervised social interaction with peers outside the home. The family dynamic, as later described in court documents, was hierarchical. Authority rested with the parents. Older children were expected to help care for younger ones. Discipline was firm, and the household was socially isolated compared to many families in the area. There was little unsupervised social interaction with peers outside the home. In public, this structure projected responsibility and order. Robert Bever had graduated high school shortly before the murders. Michael Bever was still a minor. Neither had a criminal record. There were no known reports of violent behavior to police or school officials prior to the crime. On paper, there was nothing that marked them as dangerous. Yet beneath that surface of order, the family lived inwardly, disconnected from many external support systems. The children spent much of their time inside the home or online. Friends were limited. Outside adults had little visibility into their private lives. This isolation would later become significant. Investigators would eventually learn that Robert and Michael had been consuming violent material for an extended period. They had researched mass killings, studied other crimes, and written about violence in notebooks and online messages. These behaviors were not visible to the community. They unfolded in bedrooms, on computers, and in private conversations between the brothers. There were also tensions inside the family that were not outwardly visible. Court records indicate strict discipline and internal conflict, but no formal abuse findings that would have triggered intervention. What existed instead was a closed environment where distress could remain hidden. The boys' interests increasingly diverged from the family's public identity. While the household presented itself as religious and morally structured, Robert and Michael were developing private obsessions that had nothing to do with faith or family values. Their writings reflected anger, alienation, and a desire for recognition that stood in sharp contrast to the obedient image they displayed at home. To neighbors, the Bevers were simply another large family on a quiet street. There were no flashing warning signs, no police visits, no school counselors raising alarms, no social services investigations underway. The illusion of stability held. What makes this stage of the story so disturbing is not what was seen, but what was missed. The family's public image, orderly, religious, and self-contained, functioned as camouflage. It concealed the growing divide between who they appeared to be and what was happening privately inside the minds of two of the children. In hindsight, the contrast is stark. A household defined by routine, a community defined by calm, and beneath both, ideas that would soon shatter everything. The tragedy did not arrive from outside the home. It emerged from within a family that, to everyone watching, looked ordinary, and that ordinary appearance would become the last thing anyone remembered about them before everything collapsed. Long before the night of the killings, the fracture lines were already forming. The warning signs did not appear as sudden explosions of rage. They appeared as patterns, quiet, repetitive, and concealed. According to court records and investigative findings, Robert Davis Bever and Michael John Bever began developing an intense fixation on mass violence months before the crime. This was not impulsive curiosity. It was systematic. They researched previous mass murders. They studied casualty counts. They discussed how attacks were carried out and how perpetrators became known. In notebooks later recovered by police, they wrote about killing as a way to achieve recognition. These writings were not abstract. They included lists, targets, and plans. The behavior was private, almost ritualistic. Their parents and siblings were unaware. No teacher, pastor, or neighbor saw the material. The brothers shared it only with each other. At the same time, their emotional world was narrowing. Psychological evaluations later introduced in court described increasing detachment from empathy and an obsession with notoriety. Their writings showed resentment toward authority and a desire to feel powerful in a life where they felt controlled. The family's strict structure, religious discipline, limited social contact, and rigid hierarchy created an environment where emotional conflict had no outlet. There was no documented financial crisis in the household, no insurance scheme, no inheritance motive. The stressors were psychological and relational, not economic. Investigators found no evidence of substance abuse, gambling debt, or external pressure that could explain the escalation. What did exist was isolation. The brothers spent much of their time together, apart from peers. Their worldview became self-contained. The more they immersed themselves in violent material, the more their thinking reinforced itself. Court testimony later showed that they viewed their family not as people, but as obstacles. There were also signs of deception. In the weeks leading up to the murders, Robert and Michael hid knives in their bedroom. They tested weapons. They discussed how to move through the house quietly. They spoke about killing not only their family, but others afterward. These plans were written down. They were rehearsed mentally. They were not discovered. No prior violent incidents had been reported to police. There were no restraining orders, no juvenile arrests, no school discipline records that pointed to imminent danger. That absence became part of the tragedy. Nothing visible existed that would have triggered intervention, but internally, the escalation was already underway. Their writings showed a progression from fantasy to intention. Early notes focused on other mass killers. Later notes focused on logistics. Investigators described this as a shift from obsession to preparation. It marked the point where violence became, in their minds, achievable. Psychologists who evaluated the brothers found them competent to stand trial. There was no diagnosis of psychosis that would meet legal insanity standards. What was present instead were traits of emotional detachment, fixation on violence, and distorted thinking about fame and identity. The brothers did not describe fear. They described purpose. They also lied to maintain normalcy. To their parents, they behaved as sons. To siblings, they played their roles. There were no outward confrontations, no dramatic threats. The home remained quiet. The routine continued. This is what made the escalation so dangerous. It unfolded without disruption. The warning signs existed only in journals, in digital searches, and in whispered conversations between two brothers who believed no one would stop them. Each day that passed without discovery strengthened their confidence. By the final weeks, their planning had reached a conclusion. Investigators later confirmed they had chosen a date. They had identified targets. They believed the act would transform them from invisible to unforgettable. What looked like ordinary teenage withdrawal was, in reality, a narrowing tunnel of thought, a closed system of belief where violence became the solution to frustration and notoriety replaced human connection. The collapse was no longer a possibility. It was approaching, and no one inside the house knew it was already too late. The 22nd of July 2015, late evening in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma. The neighborhood was quiet. Weather reports from that night show warm summer conditions with no storms or wind that would have disturbed the stillness. Streetlights illuminated the cul-de-sac. Inside the Bever residence, the household had settled into nighttime routine. Most family members were in their bedrooms. Shortly before 11:30 p.m., the sequence of events began. Investigators later reconstructed the timeline using forensic evidence, the 911 call, survivor testimony, and the brothers' own statements. The attackers were identified as Robert Davis Bever, 18, and Michael John Bever, 16. The lighting inside the house was minimal. Bedroom lights were off in several rooms. The home was quiet, except for ordinary nighttime sounds, air conditioning, floor creaks, and movement between rooms. The first attack occurred inside the residence against family members who were asleep or preparing for bed. The assaults were carried out with knives taken from within the home. There was no forced entry and no struggle at the exterior doors. As the brothers moved through the house, victims were attacked in their bedrooms. Evidence showed multiple locations of injury across separate rooms, indicating movement from one area of the house to another rather than a single confrontation point. One of the victims, 12-year-old Daniel Bever, was able to reach a telephone. At approximately 11:30 p.m., a 911 call was placed from inside the home. The call lasted only moments. Dispatchers later confirmed the voice on the line was a child, reporting that someone was killing his family. The call abruptly disconnected. This call marked the first external alert that something catastrophic was unfolding. Inside the house, the attacks continued. 5 family members were killed: the parents, David and April Bever, and 3 children, Daniel, Christopher, age 7, and Victoria, age 5. Crystal Bever, age 13, was also attacked, but survived with severe injuries. Autumn Bever, age 2, was not physically harmed. Forensic analysis later confirmed that the crimes occurred over a short window of time. The sequence suggested rapid movement between rooms and victims. There was no evidence of extended argument or negotiation. The violence unfolded quickly and decisively. After the attacks, Robert and Michael Bever fled the residence on foot. They exited into the surrounding neighborhood, still within the same residential block. Their departure left behind the injured survivor and the deceased victims inside the home. Police units were already en route, responding to the interrupted emergency call. At approximately 11:35 p.m., Broken Arrow police officers arrived at the residence. The exterior of the home appeared normal. There were no signs of forced entry. The street was silent. Officers entered the house and began a room-by-room search. Inside, they found multiple victims. 5 were pronounced dead at the scene. Crystal Bever was located alive, but severely wounded. Emergency medical personnel were called in immediately. Paramedics transported Crystal to a hospital for emergency treatment. She survived. While officers were still inside the house, other units began searching the surrounding area for suspects. The description was limited. 2 individuals had fled from the scene on foot. Within minutes, officers located Robert and Michael Bever hiding in nearby bushes not far from the residence. Robert was found carrying a knife. Both were taken into custody without further violence. The time from the 911 call to the arrests was approximately 30 minutes. By midnight, the street was sealed off with police tape. Patrol cars and ambulances filled the cul-de-sac. Neighbors emerged from their homes as flashing lights reflected off windows and parked vehicles. Inside the house, the crime scene remained unchanged. Investigators documented each room, each victim's location, and the sequence of events through bloodstain analysis and physical evidence. Photographs were taken, weapons were collected, notes and electronic devices were later seized. The scale of the crime became clear only after all rooms had been examined. 5 members of the same family were dead. 1 child was critically injured. 2 brothers were under arrest. By the early morning hours of July 23, the house had been classified as a mass homicide scene. News of the killings spread rapidly through Broken Arrow, and then nationally. There was no sign of burglary, no evidence of outside intrusion, no indication of an unknown attacker. Everything pointed inward to the family itself. In later court proceedings, investigators testified that the brothers had planned the attack in advance. The crime was not spontaneous, it was deliberate and sequential. The night ended with 2 suspects in custody, 1 child fighting for her life in a hospital, and a home transformed into a sealed evidence site. What had begun as an ordinary summer evening concluded as one of the most disturbing crimes in the city's history. The silence that had once defined the neighborhood was replaced by sirens, cameras, and grief. And as the sun rose over Broken Arrow the next morning, the full weight of what had occurred inside that quiet house became impossible to ignore. When officers secured the Bever residence in Broken Arrow, the initial task was to determine whether the killings were the result of an external intrusion or an internal act of violence. The lack of forced entry immediately narrowed the scope. Doors and windows showed no signs of tampering. The crime scene pointed inward. Forensic teams documented multiple rooms as separate attack sites. Blood-stain pattern analysis demonstrated movement through the house rather than a single confrontation. Knives recovered at the scene and from the suspects were consistent with the injuries documented by medical examiners. Autopsies confirmed the cause of death for the 5 victims as multiple stab wounds. The distribution and severity of wounds indicated rapid close contact assaults. Crystal Bever's injuries were also consistent with knife trauma, and her survival allowed investigators to confirm that the attackers were inside the family unit. Her testimony aligned with physical evidence showing the assaults occurred room to room, rather than in one central location. Phone records became a critical piece of the timeline. Dispatch logs verified a brief 911 call placed at approximately 11:30 p.m. from inside the house. The call abruptly disconnected. That timestamp anchored the sequence of events and allowed investigators to determine how quickly the suspects fled and how fast police arrived. Police canvassed the surrounding neighborhood for witnesses and surveillance footage. Exterior cameras from nearby homes showed no unknown individuals approaching or leaving the property. The only recorded movement was 2 figures leaving the residence on foot shortly after the emergency call. Search teams located the suspects within minutes, hiding nearby. Robert Davis Bever was found carrying a knife. Michael John Bever was unarmed at the time of arrest but linked to additional weapons recovered later. Digital evidence soon became central to the case. Investigators seized computers, notebooks, and phones from the home. What they found shifted the investigation from reaction to motive. Handwritten notes and digital files revealed extensive research into mass killings. The brothers had documented previous crimes, casualty counts, and strategies. Some writings expressed a desire to become known through violence. These materials established premeditation and contradicted any claim of spontaneous action. Financial analysis showed no robbery motive. No money was taken from the home. There were no insurance policies or inheritance plans tied to the deaths. Bank records showed no unusual transactions. This eliminated financial gain as a factor and reinforced that the motive was psychological rather than economic. Interviews with neighbors and extended family produced no reports of outside threats or conflicts. There were no restraining orders, no debt disputes, and no evidence of external pressure. This absence of an outside suspect further concentrated suspicion on the 2 brothers. During questioning, both Robert and Michael initially attempted to minimize their roles. Investigators noted inconsistencies between their early statements and the forensic timeline. Movement patterns, injury locations, and the recovered writings contradicted claims of confusion or lack of intent. Police strategy focused on confronting those contradictions with evidence. They presented timelines derived from the 911 call, bloodstain analysis, and digital records. Each step reduced the space for alternative explanations. The breakthrough moment came when investigators connected the recovered notebooks and digital searches directly to the sequence of the crime. The plans matched the layout of the house. The targets listed were family members. The timing matched the reconstructed minute-by-minute timeline. This established three key facts. The crime was planned in advance. The perpetrators intended to kill multiple people. The family itself was the chosen target. By the end of the investigation phase, there was no ambiguity about who committed the crime or how it unfolded. The remaining question was why. The case shifted from identifying suspects to preparing for court, where motive, responsibility, and punishment would be decided. The evidence no longer pointed outward. It pointed inward to two brothers and the ideas they had been building in silence. The investigation had reached its conclusion. The trial was about to begin. The courtroom in Broken Arrow was filled beyond capacity on the days that mattered most. Reporters lined the back wall. Jurors sat rigid, notebooks closed, aware that every word now carried irreversible weight. At the defense table, Robert Davis Bever and Michael John Bever appeared detached, their posture controlled, their expressions restrained. There were no outbursts, no visible displays of grief. The atmosphere was not chaotic, it was heavy with expectation. This was the moment when private violence became public record. The prosecution framed the case around intention. Their argument was direct. The killings were planned, methodical, and driven by a desire for recognition through violence. They emphasized recovered notebooks, digital searches, and the sequence of movement through the house as proof of premeditation. Medical examiner testimony established that each victim died from multiple stab wounds, and forensic reconstruction showed the attackers moved room to room. Motive was presented not as financial or situational, but psychological, an internal fixation on notoriety and power. The defense strategy diverged between the brothers. Robert's case concluded with a guilty plea, eliminating the need for a jury trial. For Michael, the defense centered on youth and psychological immaturity. Attorneys argued that he was influenced by his older brother and lacked the developmental capacity to fully comprehend the consequences of his actions. They sought to reframe culpability without disputing participation. The prosecution countered with evidence of shared planning and mutual intent. Notes, timelines, and behavior demonstrated that both brothers understood what they were doing and why. When the jury returned, the courtroom fell into complete silence. No movement, no whispers, only the sound of papers being handled. The verdict was read slowly, guilty on all counts. There were no dramatic reactions recorded in court, no collapse, no visible protest. The decision settled into the room like a final weight. The case was no longer about what happened. It was about how long its consequences would last. Sentencing followed weeks later. The judge cited the scale of the crime, the number of victims, and the evidence of planning. For Robert Bever, the sentence was life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, imposed consecutively for each murder. The death penalty was avoided through his guilty plea, but the permanence of incarceration was absolute. Michael Bever received 5 consecutive life sentences plus additional years for the assault of his surviving sister. While juvenile sentencing law technically allowed for parole eligibility in the distant future, the structure of the sentence ensured that freedom would not realistically come within a normal lifespan. There were no recorded emotional statements from the defendants at sentencing. The surviving family members remained largely absent from public view, shielded from cameras and commentary. This case leaves us with questions that don't fade easily about isolation, about warning signs, and about how violence can grow unnoticed inside ordinary spaces. If you found this documentary meaningful, consider subscribing for more in-depth investigations like this one, and feel free to share your thoughts in the comments respectfully and thoughtfully. Thank you for watching.